How's it going today, guys? I'm John Martine. I'm here to talk to you guys about the Great Depression versus the Great Recession. The Great Depression came on the heels of the Roaring Twenties. Never had the Americans' highs been so high and the lows been so low. The crash of the stock market in October 1929 ended all prosperity in the 20s. For the next 10 years, investment would fall 90% and unemployment reach an all-time high of 25%. Critics of the government quickly pointed the blame at them due to their inability to contain the recession. They believed that the stock market crash in the 20s led to the nearly 900 banks failing in the coming years. As customers ran to the banks, the banks as customers ran to the banks to withdraw what they had left, they were in for a rude awakening when banks became insolvent. Banks became banks with financial stability stopped making loans as they feared for their survival. The American middle class was ripped from the seams. It wasn't until FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, came into office, fought hard to spend his way out of the depression. Roosevelt fought hard to enact the New Deal, which was his large response to the Great Depression. The New Deal was aimed at helping the unemployed, elderly, farmers, and put safeguards on the banking sector. For the most part, the spending seemed to stimulate the economy, but the onset of World War II seemed to shift the American economy back after 10 years. The Great Recession is only rivaled in severity by the Great Depression. In 2009, the American people were brought to their knees as the housing bubble popped and toxic mortgages lined the asset pockets of banks. The too big to fail banks were staring at a barrel of a loaded gun. Once again, the American middle class felt the pain as unemployment reached 10%. Banks acted recklessly and they gave loans to people who did not have the best credit. In addition, banks then packaged these mortgages into securities to be sold off as assets. Banks lied about the credit ratings of these securities, which only amplified the Great Recession. More and more Americans bought homes, which in turn inflated housing prices. Once the bubble popped, housing prices fell, leaving Americans to foreclose on their loans. President Obama had to roll up his sleeves and act quickly before it turned into a depression. Monetary and fiscal policy was put into action to help relieve the shrinking economy. The Fed quickly took to action and enacted monetary policy to help soften the blow of the recession. Traditionally, the Fed's tools to fight recession rely on its ability to control inflation or help lower unemployment. The Fed so-called used all of its ammo when it pushed the federal funds rate to an all-time low to stimulate borrowing. When that proved ineffective, they shifted to a new tool, quantitative easing. In addition, President Obama looked to enact some fiscal policies to help the struggling American middle class by providing stimulus packages to failing companies and almost notably bailing out Wall Street. We can still feel the effect of the Great Recession today. GDP growth seems to still be sluggish, and unemployment is reasonably high. The American people still do not have faith in the economy. Analyzing both time periods, we do see some similarities in how the economy got so bad so quickly. Many point to the fact that the federal government failed to catch warning signs and were caught in the prosperous times before the hit of both recessions. During the 1920s, the Fed artificially kept interest rates low, which contributed to the financial success of the 1920s, only to raise them in the 1929s, which halted investment. Furthermore, President Hoover raised taxes in addition to enacting the Smoot-Hawley Act, which trumped American exports. Many point to the actions or lack of by President Hoover for the severity and length of the Great Depression. In 1990s, the federal government pushed home ownership on the American people, and with the dot-com boom, banks began giving loans at an unprecedented rate. Eventually, banks began giving loans to individuals whose credits were questionable. Government intervention in both cases seemed to be a contributing factor to the length and severity of the Great Depression and Great Recession. President Hoover looked to try and stimulate the economy by increasing spending on public works, roads, bridges, and infrastructures. In addition to creating some social welfare programs, once FDR came into office, he took this idea and ran with it. Roosevelt strongly believed that Hoover did not spend enough to stimulate the economy, so he did not. So he not only paid farmers to not produce, but also provided bailouts to over 900 failing banks. President Obama modeled his massive federal spending much after FDR's approach, enacting the famous $787 billion bailout plan, stimulus package that provided aid to failing companies. In addition, President Obama also enacted a pricey jobs bill that looks similar to FDR's spending on infrastructure to help out the struggling middle class. In both cases, massive federal spending that were very identical were sought to help the declining economy. Critics of this approach believe that it is impossible to spend your way out of a recession. They point to the hike in unemployment after these massive spendings as proof that the policy is inefficient. FDR looked for money to fund these incredibly expensive federal programs, turning to increasing the tax rate 79% in 1935, only later to increase it to 94% during the onset of World War II. Entrepreneurs used their wealth wisely. The high tax rates led to disincentives to make capital investments, which in turn prolonged the Great Depression. President Obama had a much harder time due to the fact that he was facing former President Bush's tax cuts. But once ended, President Obama looked to hike up the tax rates on capital gains, income, and estate. The magnitude of the Great Depression was much more severe than the Great Recession, largely in part due to the fact that multiple bubbles burst during the Depression. Certainly, we can look at the length and notice that the Depression was 6 years longer than the recession. In addition, we can look at the unemployment rate, which is 25% compared to the recession's 10%, to provide furthermore proof that the difference in magnitude. With both the Depression and Recession, Americans have taken home some valuable lessons. Poorly regulated banks led to the collapse of the stock market in 1929, and giving risky loans to uncredit-worthy people led to the collapse in 2009. These poorly regulated banks in 2009 had the mentality of being too big to fail and operated with reckless disregard. In addition, we have to take a deep look at certain fiscal policies during these times and see if they were in fact effective. FDR and Obama's stimulus packages have to get a good hard look at to see if they were in fact effective. Much doubt was left in the Americans' minds if increasing federal spending works after FDR's attempt. This left out and left out as President Obama looked to do the same. Analyzing these two events, you can clearly see some glaring similarities. The loosely regulated bank systems led to the collapse of the economies, and both presidencies' efforts seem to be ineffective. Both presidencies tried similar policies, but the Great Depression differed in length and severity. Unemployment was at an all-time high of 25% compared to the recession's 10%. One can only conclude that the banking sector needs to be closely regulated because time and time again they prove that they cannot be trusted. No.